Wait. All right, welcome to the third meta session. For this week, we will be talking about the criminal justice system. Hopefully, we'll cover all of this within the hour. Hopefully, it doesn't take too long, even though there's like dense material for this. All right, so basically, for this session, I'll be trying to answer three different questions. First of all, what is justice and what makes an action crime? And number two, I will cover what do we do when we acknowledge something is a crime. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about how do we decide the length of sentences and so on. How much a judge should prescribe a specific person if they were to be found convicted of a crime. But in order for us to talk about that, I think it's only fair that we talk about what exactly is justice in the first place. But I think this is quite intuitive. Like justice is basically the idea, like, or fairness and so on, impartiality. But within the context of the criminal justice system, and I think this is what we care about, justice is basically when the crimes that are committed within that society receives a response that we consider to be deserving. And those who are accused of those crimes, they will be judged with a fair trial. They get the appropriate responses within that respective culture, society, or nations or tradition and so on. But all of this is still dependent on what we constitute a crime. And this is where the definition of what exactly is a crime can be debatable, and it is not sort of like the same throughout societies itself. So if we were to take like a general picture on what exactly is a crime, we can say that crimes are actions that are considered to be unlawful, or the state wants to sort of like discourage that. Now, a crime in itself, it's not just a moral wrong. Not all moral wrongs are crimes. And for some people, not all crimes are actually moral wrongs. It depends on that society. But when it comes to moral wrongs, let's say, for example, lying is a moral wrong, but not everyone within a society might not see that as something that is punishable, unless, of course, if it's like misleading advertising or fraud. So that's when a moral wrong becomes a crime. And more often than not, there's a reason why that specific moral wrong becomes a crime, and we'll cover that in a bit. But having a wrong alone, it's not enough. It's not enough to just say that something is morally wrong, then automatically it becomes a crime. There must be a reason why that's so. But to evaluate, what is a crime, it's normally divided into two different parts. Unfortunately, there are no law students here in Unimas, so this might not be intuitive. But when it comes to crimes, you have two different parts to this. You have what we call actus reus and mens rea. So actus reus is the act that is considered wrong by the state, the actual action of it. But that action alone is not enough. You also need the intention, because it's kind of unfair for you to punish someone for not having the intention. And if your goal as a government is to discourage certain behaviors, then it's only fair that you take into account the intention of someone, because punishing that wouldn't actually lead to a deterrence for that crime itself or that action itself, because they don't have the intention to proliferate that specific action. So it's only fair that the intention gets taken into account. So let's take, for example, someone crashing into another person, whatever it is, a car and so on. There's a possibility that they did not intend to crash into that person. And you could sort of like judge that whatever the circumstances are, they might not have a desire to hurt the other person. So it's unfair for you to consider that as a crime. It's only fair if you consider that to be an accident. I think a great example will probably be the question about Sam Kating and how she ran into, I don't know how many kids, but they were on bicycles and so on. And the Court of Appeal in Malaysia decided to say that it's not a crime, it's an accident, because she did not have the intention to run over those kids. Of course, there are situations where you might have strict liability. So there are some crimes that sort of like um, apply some kind of duty of care for you, but we'll go into that in a bit. At the same time, lack of intention cannot be confused with ignorance of the law. So just because you said that, oh, I didn't know the law says you cannot do that, the government doesn't care. They want to punish certain behaviors as long as you have the intention to do that and you actually carry it out. That means that you have committed a crime. But also at the same time, just because I said that certain moral wrongs are not crimes, it does not mean the state does not acknowledge that. It's just that there are different courts for this kind of thing. So you have criminal courts and you have civil courts. So when it comes to criminal courts, that's where it is an action against the state. So the state says that this is a behavior that we don't tolerate and we will punish you for that. But when it comes to civil courts, this is where you have individuals who are not happy against each other. And maybe there are some direct harms because of that. And that's where you can claim certain damages from that specific person. So we'll take a bit detour for a bit. Let's talk about the difference between civil and criminal. So a civil wrong is between individuals within a state, while a criminal wrong is between individuals and the state, like I said earlier. So there are times where wrongs are considered to be a threat to the legitimacy of the state. And there are wrongs that actively harm specific individuals. So if there is a collective interest to write a law about it and becomes part of the legislation of that country, then that becomes a criminal wrong because there is a collective interest of it. But if you have experienced civil wrong as an individual, then it hurts you, maybe it hurts your business, it hurts your reputation, whatsoever, it's only fair that you can sue the other person because there is an active harm brought by that person itself. So an example of this would be defamation. So remember earlier on I said that lying is a moral wrong, but not all forms of lying are prosecuted by the state. Stuff like fraud, stuff like misleading advertising and so on. All of that the state will care about. But when it comes to, let's say, defamation, where you actively led to the cause of someone's loss of possible income, whatsoever, then that form of lying, you can sue the other person, and that is a civil wrong. Other forms of civil wrong will probably be vicarious liability. So vicarious liability is when the person who employs another person and within that service of that employer hurt another person, that is vicarious liability. So let's say that if I were to hire Gertrude to deliver pizza, and I say that you must deliver this pizza within 25 minutes to a specific area, really short period. And then you decided to speed through things and you accidentally killed someone in the process, or you hurt someone in the process. Okay, if killed as a whole, that's criminal instead. But let's say you hurt another person. Then I am responsible for that action because I benefit from those ridiculous requirements to get you to send things within 25 minutes. I make money out of your effort for that. So that's vicarious liability and so on. Or maybe if I were a boss and I don't care about OSHA practices, and this is where another form of liability might exist. Or maybe if I were to do construction and I don't inform anyone about it and I decide to continue construction middle of the night, and then it causes a lot of like mental damage, like stress, and so on. All of that falls under civil wrongs. There's a lot of health complications within that. So those are things that the state doesn't really punish all the time because it's still very dependent on the damages that you go through, unless it is like written within the law that society has agreed that all of this needs to be punished by the state because all of us agree by the nature of all of this is a crime, and then it becomes a crime. But if no one turns that into a crime, that's probably a civil thing. And then you go through civil litigation for that. So again, it depends on case by case basis on it. Now, when does a wrong become a crime? Now, for a wrong to be considered a crime, it has to go through a process of criminalization. Now, there's no one single path to criminalization. There's actually a lot of ways to go through this. So if you see other categories and so on, it's probably something similar. But if it were up to me, I will divide it into these two different parts. Criminalization that comes from governance and criminalization that comes through norms. We'll talk about norms a bit later, but we'll cover governance first. So in order for governments to be effective, for them to have legitimacy, if you could remember that from our first class, there needs to be some kind of baseline in order for them to actually operate. If they cannot control society, then they don't have that form of legitimacy that they've been fighting for. So if you fail to do that, that means governance is harder. So there needs to be some kind of level of expected behavior from everyone. And when it comes to these behaviors, I guess there are three different kinds of categories on what governments tend to limit from it. So the first one is general harm. Number two, social order and procedure. And thirdly, and this is slightly different from the rest because it implies a duty on behalf of citizens, and not living up to those duties would eventually lead to a crime. And I'll show how that is different in comparison to the first two. Okay, so this one is quite obvious when it comes to harm. When there is overwhelming harm produced by an action, that is, of course, is the interest of all of us to make sure that that harm doesn't continue, like murder. So this is quite intuitive. So if you are a government and you cannot stop murder within the borders of your country, you cannot actually carry that out. That means you failed as a government to protect your citizens from harm itself. So this includes direct harms like murder, theft, assault, battery, whatever it is. And the state has an interest in making sure that it doesn't proliferate, and other individuals, cannot seriously stop other people from hurting each other. So the state has to take charge in this case because they are the only ones who have that monopoly of violence in that sense. Of course, that's debatable. Some people argue that collective action could lead to something, but this is the general idea. When governments apply the idea of what exactly is a crime to this kind of harms, then they want to control that behavior in order for them to have that kind of legitimacy in the long run. Okay. At the same time, states also put regulations on different entities in order to stop this kind of harms. So, for example, environmental regulations can go beyond a civil wrong. Like I said earlier, if society collectively has agreed that this is a specific crime that needs to be punished within the laws or whatsoever, polluting a water source, logging in protected areas, and the state acknowledges the future harm for that, then the state would consider that as a harm and that it would eventually criminalize that act. And if they don't do it, of course, they would lose legitimacy within the process. The next thing that we need to sort of like understand when it comes to criminalization for governance is the idea of social order and procedure. So prior to this, when we talk about harm, there is some level of social order within that. You control the possible harms and then you eventually lead to some kind of social order. But when I say social order and procedure, there is a different nuance to this. This is where you could argue that the state needs to maintain certain actions or to encourage certain actions in order for you to build institutions so that there is some kind of order within that society. So, for example, a state may want to encourage things like freedom of association, freedom of assembly, but there are procedures in place to make sure that things don't become chaotic or whatsoever, and people who fail to follow these kind of things might be charged with a certain crime or something along those lines. It depends on the values of that state and depends on how much that state would like to control it. But the point I'm making here is that criminalization can arise from this. Let's take another example. When it comes to building institutions. So when you are a government that would like everyone to act in a certain way to make sure that people, respect whatever procedures that you have. You might want to build certain institutions, and these institutions allow you to manage peace in certain ways. So, for example, you might want to protect the judiciary, and you want people to take a look at the judiciary as a body that is respected, and there is some kind of finality when the judiciary says someone is wrong, and so on. Well, someone needs to show up in court. Someone needs to come in and say that you need to respect all of these orders or whatsoever. And failure to live up to these behaviors can be criminalized and has been used as a reason to criminalize something. So a great example of this would be contempt of court. If this happens in a different situation where you disrespect a certain authority or you don't show up to class whatsoever, no one cares, because it does not involve an institution that needs to be protected, whatever it is, or no one really cares about this specific kinds of authority that is not respected, not acknowledged by the state. But when it comes to the judiciary is an authority that gives some kind of finality, that interprets the law, and people need access to it, and it needs some kind of stability in order for it to work. So contempt of court, when you don't show up for, let's say, trials, or when you defy a court order, or when you make it hard for people to continue the process of court, and so on, or make it hard for people to enforce whatever procedure, etc. This then makes it hard for people to believe in this institution. So criminalization leads to a deterrence from all of these actions. So people then respect these institutions, and that leads to some kind of social order. Another example would be using illegally obtained evidence in court. Now, technically, when you have evidence, evidence is evidence, whatever it is, and it could help people's case. But you don't want to encourage certain behaviors like blackmail. You don't want to encourage behaviors like getting into another person's house for evidence and then presenting it. So there's a lot of possible abuse that comes from that. So the state forces everyone to follow the procedure, even if something that's found illegally can be used in court and it might change the outcome of the case. The state says we need to follow certain procedures, we need to respect it, or else all of the other actions that follow after that suddenly goes haywire. And criminalization helps you to control these kind of behaviors. People sort of like follow through that and maintain the traditions, so on. Okay, so when it comes to social order, if what I said early on was basically based on what the state needs to carry out or what is necessary for the state to exist, then at the same time, you also have to admit that sometimes corporations do try to influence what the state considers to be necessary. So the state might receive certain pressures from different lobby groups to consider certain actions to be criminal. And they would take that into account in whatever legislation that they're writing. So for example, internet piracy. It's an issue of intellectual property. Normally, it's the corporations that are able to, stop people from pirating something, whatsoever. But they are able to pressure a government to recognize things like intellectual property for this kind of things, and that eventually leads to the criminalization of file sharing or something along those lines. Or the example that I like to use is actually jaywalking. When you think back about it, jaywalking should not be a crime because cities should be made for humans. But the car lobby managed to criminalize that and create this perception that there is only social order if you prioritize cars, because cars are larger and so on. So jaywalking has been converted into a crime. Of course, it's not really enforced and so on, but if somebody wants to enforce it, they could along those lines. I'm sorry? Yeah, I guess so. It doesn't work in Malaysia, but that's the origin of jaywalking. Jaywalking it's not a crime because everyone agreed socially for it. It's just that governments receive pressure from car manufacturers for it to be a crime. Right. So when it comes to governance, the third way for criminalization is through duty and omissions. So if you were to take a look at the first two ways of criminalization through governance, they're all very reliant on you doing something, and then that's wrong. But when it comes to duty and omissions, it's the opposite. So this is where you have to admit the state cannot regulate everything, or the state cannot save everyone all the time. So it's not like there is an agent of the state that could save you from drowning, in this sense. So when it comes to duty and omissions, the state prescribes certain duties towards you, and if you can carry out that duty, but you refuse to do so, that could be a crime, and criminalization could happen through that. So let's say, for example, you have the ability to save someone, and let's say someone is drowning, in that sense. So in countries with what we call Good Samaritan laws, they expect people to save them. If you have the ability, and let's say it was found that you don't actually get nervous in this kind of situations, but you just stand on the sideline and just look at it, like a psychopath in that sense. You have the ability to save them. You can do it. Like, you are physically able. So the state would say that this is actively condemning someone to die in that sense. And Good Samaritan laws allows you to punish this kind of people. So that's where criminalization come in. So failure to carry out these duties are considered criminal in that sense. So while someone might say that, well, I didn't have an intention to hurt them, but because you have the ability to do so, but you still refuse to do it, intention can be constructed from it. I think another example would be like when it comes to duty of care for dependents. So it depends from country to country, though. There are some countries that would punish parents that neglect their children. So technically, they're not actively harming that person, as in like they're not doing something, they're not stabbing this person. But let's say a parent decides not to feed their child. That's where child services can take away the child, or they get punished for criminal negligence for that. Or if you are an employer and you know that some scaffolding is not safe, and you just say that, I don't care, just let these people climb up and so on. And you know that people will die if you don't take any precautions whatsoever, and people get injured in the process, then there should be some level of criminalization for that. So basically, if there is some refusal to carry out those duties, that would eventually lead to criminalization through omission. That's it. All right, so let's move on to the next one. Norms. Now, most of the crimes that we've spoken so far, they're all based on tangible impacts. There is some form of harm from it. But when it comes to norms, there isn't necessarily like tangible impacts that are related to it, but instead it depends on the will of that society. If that society views certain actions to be morally wrong and they think it should be discouraged and actively punished, that would eventually lead to criminalization. So there are a lot of crimes we could consider to be victimless crimes, but it's still criminalized within that sphere. So if there is political will and somebody thinks, turns it into a huge political issue, it would travel from the cultural sphere into the political sphere, and then that eventually becomes legislation, and that will lead to criminalization. So these are things like, let's say, consumption of drugs. Technically, if you were to take a look at any other form of consumption that still hurts people, we don't penalize them. We don't hurt them. So for example, if somebody, let's say, eats too much or consumes a lot of sugar and they get diabetic and so on, it hurts. Well, that's zero sugar. Okay, no sugar in that. Okay, but what I'm saying is that if people also hurt themselves through other means, then when you think back about it, it's kind of weird that drugs are singled out for a lot of things for this action. They hurt themselves through the process, but it's their individual body. But society has agreed that the harms that comes from drug taking is probably more visceral, or in the case of the United States, there's a racial element to it because certain drugs are more accessible for different communities, and they want to discourage their presence or whatsoever. And this is where criminalization of drugs came in, and the rest of the world eventually followed suit because the rest of the world adopted those moral norms instead. So there are a lot of other things like sexual activities that doesn't harm another person. But if that society has collectively agreed that this is against the moral norms of that society, then eventually that also leads to criminalization. Things like homelessness. Homelessness is not a moral failure, but that society has viewed that as a norm that they don't want to encourage. So they would ban things like begging in certain areas, or they would put up hostile architecture and they would push people out from certain city centers, and they would ban people from sleeping on benches in certain areas and criminalize that. Loitering and vagrancy. Loitering is only an issue because businesses don't like the idea of certain undesirable groups hanging out around that area. When you think back about it, that person is just standing there doing nothing. It doesn't hurt anyone, but there is a norm within that community to view that as a bad act that society should discourage instead. So that's where loitering, vagrancy, homelessness becomes an issue, or blasphemy, and so on. All of these are norms within that society that eventually turns into crimes. Of course, there are a lot of controversies around criminalization of norms. This is where prejudicial behavior can be masked and say that this is how you maintain quote unquote order within society, and this is how they justify it through what governance, through social order, and so on. And at the same time, it is also a way for people to mask up their failure of governance. So let's say, for example, homelessness is an economic issue, but for them to push aside all of this, they could say that, oh, we're going to criminalize sleeping in the streets, and this is how it makes it harder for people to see all of this, and they can claim that they solve certain economic issues, or at the very least, people don't talk about the root cause of things. And there are times where things like consumption of drugs over punishes certain communities, certain poorer communities, because richer neighborhoods probably don't have the same kind of over policing. Maybe they live in gated neighborhoods, so they don't face the same kind of problems. But poorer communities that face over policing do face problems of over punishing when it comes to consumption of drugs. All right, so considering all of it, now that we've identified where do crimes come from, what exactly is justice, whatever it is. So if a crime is an action that the state punishes in order to discourage such actions and to maintain social order, and justice is to be fair, then the criminal justice system as a whole, all of that, you can describe that as a system that provides a fair process for those who have been accused of a crime and the repercussions when one is found guilty of said crimes. So in handling all of this, that is the criminal justice system. So what bodies are within that criminal justice system? So this is not an exhaustive list. There are other bodies that might be involved in this also, but it's normally law enforcement, the judiciary, and this also includes all the other parties like, let's say, lawyers, prosecution team, and so on, the prison system, or any other body that sort of like oversees punishments. I guess in countries that don't see prisons as the one and only way to punish people, you'll probably have different bodies. So this might include social workers and so on. So all of that, that is the criminal justice system. So once you understand this, and then you can understand other debates when it comes to the CJS. And so, okay, considering this, let's move on to the second part. What happens when someone commits a crime? So we've spoken about the origins of a crime. What happens then when we've acknowledged that it's a crime? Now, for that labeling of crime to be meaningful, this is where punishment needs to come in. Whatever the punishment is, like less serious stuff, will probably be fines, community service, certain court orders, so on. Most serious ones, and this is where you can talk about what we're normally used to: punishments, house arrest, corporal punishments, and I guess sometimes the death penalty. Now, let's talk about what do we take into account when it comes to punishment. Now, the three more popular angles or the most discussed angles are deterrence, retribution, and rehabilitation. So the main questions that come for this, let's talk about deterrence first. So deterrence is the idea that you could scare someone to not do anything. So when you factor in deterrence, the question that you're asking is, will the punishment affect how possible perpetrators rethink of actually doing the crime? Like whether they will actually do it or not. Retribution is when people question whether the punishment is adequate. So there is some level of revenge that's going on here to inflict retribution to another person. So that is more like the perspective of the victim in some sense. The third one is rehabilitation. So rehabilitation is when, well, it comes to the name, we rehabilitate someone so that they don't repeat whatever they've been doing, and then you can avoid them continuing, coming back to jail, recidivism, so on. Now, there are other factors, but I would consider this as sub-factors, to be honest. I do think they're less important when it comes to discussing about different arguments or principles within debate. The first one is denunciation. I do think that the whole thing about deterrence and so on, denunciation is sort of part of it. But basically, when governments figure out punishments, they also want to figure out how they can discourage the rest of society in associating themselves with that crime. So you want to sort of like stigmatize certain behavior. So if an act continues to be punished and the criminals are stigmatized, the idea of their actions are looked down upon within that society. Then, of course, you have incapacitation. So this is where you are able to stop the perpetrator from continuing what they could do and so on. Now, incapacitation just means that they aren't able to hurt another person within the process itself. Now, not all the factors, like I mentioned earlier, the first three ones, they won't automatically lead to a safer society. There is a lot of variance from that. So a lot of people argue that we still put people in jail, not just because of the three things that we mentioned earlier, but also because we want to incapacitate them. At the very least, people are safe. Maybe rehabilitation isn't 100%, 100% working or whatever it is. It's not the best solution to things. Maybe retribution and deterrence is the best. But at the very least, when you put people in jail, there is some level of incapacitation. And some people argue, at the very least, it makes it harder for them to hurt another person. And to them, I guess that is good enough. All right, so let's go through the first three things that I mentioned earlier: deterrence, retribution, and rehabilitation in detail. All right, so how does deterrence work? So deterrence assumes that most of us are rational. So a rational person tends to make a risk-benefit analysis from whatever decision they want to make. So if the punishment is greater than whatever reward that exists, then theoretically, that person would avoid carrying out that act. Now, let's say, for example, you want to have fines for speeding and so on. And let's say that there is a credible way for governments to figure out who you are. Like, I'm pretty sure most governments have a database whatsoever, and the probability of getting caught by these cameras and so on. So all of this will sort of like discourage people from speeding, and then that eventually would reduce number of accidents and reckless driving. So deterrence stop people from actually carrying out that if they are rational. Now, why do people still care about deterrence itself? So, like I said, deterrence is part of denunciation. You want to stigmatize actions, but of course, there's only a limit on how much you can stigmatize. But deterrence acts as a signaling effect for whoever that is governing. So let's say if you want to deter people from consuming drugs, let's say that's the case, or drug possession in general. So it helps the education for it. So if the education sort of like hits a limit, like there's a ceiling to that education, then parents or teachers can just say that, well, you go to jail if you do this, etc. And that would factor into the mindset of maybe younger kids would eventually avoid because their imagination of jail is actually quite horrible or etc. It is. But it is a bit flawed, and I'll talk about why it's flawed in a bit. But in general, it's a signaling effect for what that specific society cares at that moment. All right, so what are the limits of deterrence? So the problem with deterrence, number one, is that it assumes that all actors are rational when making decisions, that they would actually make that risk analysis benefit, but not everyone are emotional, so rational all the time. A lot of us are captured within emotions or the environments that we have, and sometimes the way we react to things might be very different, but it does not mean that they are irrational. It's probably rational for them to take a lot of this risk and still break the law because maybe their environment pushed them to that, especially when it comes to economic crimes or the peer pressure that they face, the people around them that pushes them to do that, whatever environment that creates that. Within that context, it's probably rational to break the law because the reward is good enough. Maybe the reward is quite good for them because they come from an economically deprived background. So a person could succumb to economic pressure, and that might be their only answer to their life. So this is where whatever deterrence that you have, let's say, for example, the mandatory death penalty. A person who is desperate might not care of the mandatory death penalty because what they imagine is the result of selling whatever drugs that they have or drug possession or smuggling and so on. It doesn't scare them because the rational decision is to put food on the table, and it makes sense within that context in itself. So in that case, deterrence, rather than become a way to push away crime, to push away the possibility of committing crime, it then becomes a way for people to grandstand about whatever their beliefs are in that society. For example, Singapore and Malaysia can use this as a way to say that, oh, we don't tolerate drugs eventually. But it doesn't actually deter people, but deterrence becomes an excuse for them to go overbearing and to punish more people than what is necessary instead. Then the other limit of deterrence is credibility. If your government isn't credible in punishing things, then it doesn't actually harm other people. So let's say, for example, if you have a certain crime like jaywalking, no one exactly enforces jaywalking, so no one gets deterred with whatever fines they have. So there is no credibility to it. Or a state might be so corrupt that you can just bribe people. Then deterrence doesn't make sense in that context. But all the punishments become a way to grandstand. So a corrupted government can say that, oh, we will punish X, Y, Z, whatsoever. But if all the police are corrupt and won't enforce the laws, then there is no credibility within it. So it only allows people to be righteous and stuff like that. Then at the same time, the other issue with credibility is when you punish people through deterrence, whatsoever, it does not actually show the moral righteousness of the state, but it gives a good reason for people to rebel against the state instead, if people don't buy into the values of that state. So let's say, for example, sexual crimes against sexual minorities and so on. It becomes a source of legitimacy for people who wants to rebel against the social conservatism of that state. So all these heavy punishments whatsoever only creates antagonism, or it creates people who don't believe in those kind of values, some kind of legitimacy, and they claim through that, and that sort of like destroys the credibility of the state. throughout the process. And next one is the possible over punishment and political capture. So if you have a government that believes in quote unquote law and order style of governing, they want to punish everyone, give out heavy punishments or whatsoever it is, all of these laws that they write and all of these punishments becomes a cover for their failure in different things. So they say that, oh, we want to deter all these crimes and we should give you 15 years for a simple crime and so on. And they say that, oh, we're doing a good job for this. This would eventually lead to the government ignoring the root cause of the problem, or it could make the problem even worse. And I think a great example of this is mass incarceration in the United States. Like the United States holds so many prisoners in the world. And a huge chunk of them are from economically disenfranchised groups. So a government that believes in like law and order and stuff like that, they will carry out things like mandatory minimums or 3-strike laws. And that would punish more people down the line, even though they don't deserve certain things in the first place. Or they would double the punishment because of 3-strike laws. And then it makes them again stigmatized when they leave prison and they don't have the ability to participate within the economy, and it makes it hard for them to find an income and they go back and repeat the same crimes whatsoever. But these governments don't have to fix the root cause because they've already achieved their quote-unquote goal on the other end by saying that we have been tough on crime in itself. And then it becomes a tautological argument, as in like an argument that justifies itself. So we need to increase more punishment because of all these crimes. And all of these crimes shows that we need to increase the punishment for this and so on. So it's a very circular argument in that sense. You want to punish more crimes, but you don't solve the root cause of things. But deterrence encourages the idea that okay, so the next factor that is taken into how much we should punish another person or how we can punish another person is retribution. So, like I said earlier, most crimes come from a position that there is some kind of it's created within the process. Now, if society has no feelings, let's say you only care about outcomes, then probably incapacitation is good enough. Rehabilitation is probably good enough. As long as people can become good people after they leave jail. But so retribution then eventually allows individuals to carry out, use the state to carry out whatever punishments you have. So retribution is sort of like necessary to acknowledge certain things. You need to acknowledge that there is a specific harm. You need to acknowledge what is society's position in that society. You want the rest of the world to understand that this is a harm that all of you don't want to experience. So you use the state as a vehicle for you to punish the person. You want to feel some sense of justice, fairness, or simple as you want some kind of closure. So let's say, for example, a family member of yours went through rape or got murdered, etc. You want that some kind of closure. So you want that feeling that yes, this person got punished throughout. Or you guarantee by the state that yeah, you're on my side. You are protecting me, and other people who might go through this. And at the same time, you need retribution so that there is some form of legitimacy within the state. So, individuals don't go out and shoot another person because they think that they're wrong. So if you believe in, certain procedures, then retribution is an angle that you need to sort of like acknowledge that people do have feelings about certain things, and you use the state to punish people. Don't punish people by yourself because you might not investigate things, because you might hurt other people within the process. or vigilantism might breed more violence throughout the process, and other people who don't follow your same standards might also want to enact this kind of thing. So basically, a state of anarchy uh, is conduct. The state comes to final say, use the state. So that's where we're. But there are limits to persecution. Um, not disallow anyone whose punishment strikes. This one is simple. There is a reason why we don't allow victims to choose that cause. How it's
Karen, I don't know if you can hear me, but I guess your voice is a little unclear to me.
oh,
Like the last few, yeah.
Okay, is it clearer now?
Yeah, this one's better. Yeah.
Okay, great. So yeah, when it comes to how we respond to crimes, all of us are very different individuals with very different backgrounds, and we have subjective responses to things. So some of us might overpunish. Maybe you could argue in a moral sense, yes, I deserve to punish this person. But it might be unfair. Like, let's say a victim of robbery, so that this person deserves to die, or this person needs to stay in jail forever. It needs to be proportionate, it needs to be accurate to whatever is going on. The state needs to come in. The state cannot become that go for revenge, or else you don't know where.
Karen, sorry, it's unclear again.
Excuse me. Hello? Is it better now?
Yeah, now it's better.
Okay. So subjectivity means that all of us have very different perceptions of what needs to be punished. Like we have very different experiences. So the state needs to come in and say that, there is some kind of finality that we need to eventually agree on. Then of course, proportionality is on. But lastly, the next limit of retribution is that we eventually want people to reconcile. So even if you're not happy, let's say with 15 years of this person in jail, sometimes it's healthier if the victim just acknowledge that, yeah, this limit is acceptable from the state so that you are able to move on. Or the criminal is able to ask for forgiveness or able to feel some kind of guilt rather than think that, oh, I'm being overly punished within that situation. So there is no need for the victim to forgive, but at least that space needs to exist in the first place. So that sort of like allows some form of finality for the victim in the end. All right. The next factor we want to talk about, or we should cover, is rehabilitation. So what is the goal of rehabilitation? The problem with deterrence and retribution is that there is an upper limit to those two factors. If you want a safer society, this is where you need all components within that society to eventually live in harmony. And without people repeating those crimes over and over, and then you want people to act like normal human beings by the time they leave prison. So there are several goals that rehabilitation is expected to achieve. The first one, I guess the most obvious, is to stop recidivism, or basically people repeating those crimes again. Next one is you want people to contemplate what is going on within their minds, or what did they do, and so on. Thirdly, you want to integrate them within society, and you want to eventually find the root causes of all of these things. And lastly, of course, you want to reduce possible harm. You want to make sure that these people are incapacitated. But I'm not going to talk about incapacitation in depth here because I sort of covered that early on. All right. Stopping recidivism. You want criminals to eventually stop doing whatever they've been doing that led them in jail in the first place. So this normally means having an outlet so that you could acknowledge their backgrounds or their well-being, and you could, provide therapy along those lines. You could figure out why do they act in a certain way, and you help them work out of that position in itself. So prison systems that are very reliant rehabilitation often have professionals that work through these problems. If it's their alienation in their behavior, well, maybe they would receive therapy along those lines. And maybe they would have professionals that are able to help them get out of this. Then, if you have economic problems, probably you came from a economically disenfranchised family, then they would find ways to make sure that you are able to, build your character, build your work ethic, probably figure out a skill that you could eventually learn throughout this process. So this sort of like reduce the possibility of relapse and these people eventually falling back into communities that led them to these crimes in the first place. Maybe they could move away from these communities that originally hurt them in the process. Then you have contemplation. You eventually want these people to sit in jail, think about whatever they're doing, and it gets them to appreciate their freedom more. So the next time around, when they are released from prison, they understand how it feels like to have their freedom taken away. And at the same time, this is where prisoners are encouraged to read, build character, focus on themselves, whatever the method is. We'll talk about the methods later on. So how is rehabilitation carried out? So this is where you have prison job programs, though it's controversial in some sense because some people might argue that this leads to forced labor or labor with low wages. So, for example, in prison, I don't think you'll receive the minimum wage. Probably you'll get cents to the dollar instead. You will, work in prison, but this is where the prison industrial complex comes in. And that's why there are a lot of private prisons in the United States. So they would have all these private prisons, but they turn them into manufacturing bases instead. But some people argue that this can be job training so that in the future you could use that as experience, I guess. So you don't have to fall back to crimes in order to do whatever it is. Access to therapy, access to education. I guess it's common now in prison for people to study in prison. Some people even do their degrees in prison. Like, if I'm not mistaken, Najib is doing his PhD in prison right now. That's what I think I read that before. Yeah. Next time we should probably have two mics so that okay, right. But then it will accidentally turn into a podcast instead. But anyway, yeah. They're encouraged to study in prison. I should share this article that I screenshot and put here. So these prisoners, got into a Bard College initiative, and one of the guys in this article, I should have dropped the link here, but one of the guys who did a degree in mathematics or something when he was in prison. I guess if you have 7 to 10 years in prison, you may as well do a degree in math, right? I don't know, degree in biology, probably do a second degree, whatever. Like, they wouldn't be able to do that if they were outside, because they don't receive the support for it. Yeah, so yeah, commit crime to get scholarships. We should probably do that. Okay, maybe not. Maybe not in Malaysia. Not in Malaysia. Yeah. But the point is that a lot of people, those who weren't able to finish high school even, are able to graduate with the high school diploma. And because they're in prison, they're not doing anything else. They probably did well in the high school diploma that eventually allowed them to apply for colleges, and they just do their long distance learning. I guess since COVID, all of us are doing the same. Yeah, in that sense. Or like some of this class. Anyway, right. Yeah. Yeah, and then some people decide to become religious in prison instead. But there's a lot of controversy when it comes to preaching in prison, because number one, the only reason why they are listening to you is because they have nowhere else to go. So it's kind of unfair because it's not like they have other alternative communities. So you have a lot of people who get converted within prison. When you think back about it, it's not like they had a choice. Like that's one of the few ways that they can show that, or they are improving when it comes to their behavior. That the few ways for them to show that they've become a good person and they learned something throughout the process. We have no idea if that person would actually convert if they had other alternatives. So some people argue that this kind of conversions are normally out of desperation, or they don't know other alternatives. They cannot find meaning in other things. But if you have a regular social life, you might find meaning in other activities. So you might not have converted. And in that sense, then probably conversion is fair because you had the active choice to be part of it. Like when it comes to this, you probably don't have the same active choice to eventually become more religious. And so that's why it became more controversial to have um, mosque or churches within prison. But I still think it exists. But I don't know, in my opinion, as long as they don't hurt anyone throughout the process and they become better people of it, even if it's out of desperation, to me it's good enough. Then you have community service or social service. So if you put people in meaningful services and they find some meaning in it, then in the future they might be able to, I don't know, continue in that profession whatsoever. So a good example of this is that in the United States, um, in some states, it's like California, they don't have enough people who want to become firefighters. So what they do is that they train prisoners to become firefighters instead. But they derive a lot of meaning from it because it is a form of community service that requires a lot of attention, requires a lot of hard work. Basically, you are training and learning to do something useful. So when they get out from prison, they just become firefighters and do jobs that people don't want to do in the first place, or they become social workers and they become better people throughout the process. So rehabilitation allows that transition into um, a different life. Yes. I think Sadiq was the one who said that prisoners should be allowed to be interns or something. Yeah, I don't mind, but it was kind of weird that is his priority. Like, it's still sort of like forced labor in some sense, whatever. Still, yeah, internships. I mean, it's better. It helps them improve themselves better than them rotting in a jail cell. But I guess if I were to be a prisoner, I'll probably choose to study or maybe do something like firefighting. Then at least I get to get out, do shit, rather than stuck in prison not doing anything. Right. And then there are some countries that allow military service, but normally they offer this to non-violent criminals. So like petty theft or fraud, whatever, first-time offenders. They used to do that in the UK, but then they reduce it because there's no need for it. But in the US, they are encouraging it in some states. To me, it's kind of like, wow, that you put criminals in the military. Uh, I don't know. I don't think it's a good idea, to be honest, because these are people. Okay, to be fair, it might give them some sense of meaning, whatever. But I just think it's wild that you are giving criminals guns. That's what I'm imagining in my head. Of course, there is some kind of discipline that they sort of like force into them, but it's still a bit odd. And I guess I don't know the full context of this. All right. But yeah, so to be fair, it's non-violent prisoners. And I guess this normally means like kids who are 18, 19 years old who stole something from a grocery store and they get offered that. Go to go to the military instead. Well, I don't know. I guess being in a military barracks is like prison anyway. Right. So yeah. What happens when rehabilitation is the priority? So most prisons in the world don't have the budget to prioritize rehabilitation. Like training people to become firefighters is not cheap. Training people or give like you said, giving scholarships, not cheap if you want to call it scholarships. But anyway, but the point is that it's not a cheap thing. So most prisons tend to focus on deterrence and retribution. So it is possible to create a system that skews heavily on rehab. So it is still possible to do so. So I think a great example is like the Norwegian system. This is what most people tend to see the best model of rehabilitation is. So in Norway, they have the lowest rate of recidivism. Only 20% of inmates reoffend within 5 years. And you don't have things like life imprisonment. You don't have things like death penalty. They have huge emphasis on human rights. They believe that if you treat people like any other human being, then they will become good people, or they would try to work on themselves eventually. Okay, so this is not Norway, but I remember watching a video of this guy who I think he's in Estonia. He was guilty of murder, but he was allowed to run his startup from prison. And there are times where they allowed him to be on campus to study for his degree. But he has to, so it's kind of weird that he can go to campus, but he has to go back to prison. So during the day, he goes to campus and he goes back to prison. So his prison is basically like a hostel instead. Yeah, free accommodation. Free accommodation. Yeah. And it depends on their behavior. Sometimes they don't need prison guards to accompany, but as long as he comes back, or as long as like they have electronic monitoring and so on. But the thing about the Norwegian system, prison is like still like the last resort for them, because they care a lot about other things like house arrest, electronic monitoring, or constant reporting at police stations wherever they go, whatever it is. All right. So third question: how do we then determine prison sentences if we think prison sentences are supposed to be the adequate punishment? So there are three general ways that we determine prison sentences. Number one, through legislative requirement, depends on what is written within the law. Number two, it's through a judge's professional discretion. And number three, through behavioral observation. They see how receptive you are towards rehabilitation, how good you are as a person in jail, and so on. Now, when it comes to legislative requirement, it's very dependent on what that society thinks. So, like, for example, early on we said that we argued that criminalization is very dependent on what that society believes, especially when it comes to norms. I guess prison sentences are also a reflection on the severity of that crime within that society instead. All right. There are times where mandatory minimums are written into the law. So mandatory minimums are like the basics that judges cannot escape. So if that law says that you are going to jail automatically for 10 years, judges cannot run away from that. That's the basic minimum. And I think so many countries have drug possession laws that has a minimum for it, so judges cannot go lower than those specific number of years. Then you have the three strikes law. So there are non-serious crimes that only carries like a really short stint in prison, probably 6 months or whatever. But there's some countries, especially governments that want to show that they are protecting law and order, so they have things like three strikes laws. And a great example is, I guess, in the United States you have three strikes laws, and you have people who commit like very petty crime, probably theft, and then they get caught 3 times. By the third time, they're treated as if they are committing a serious crime. So that's how you have people, especially poor people, who commit all of these petty crimes, eventually get in jail for like 15, 20 years when they probably don't deserve those 20 years. But those are mandatory minimums that the judge cannot go around. But because we had a period in the United States where or they want to carry out a law and order kind of attitude and things, they have this kind of things instead. Three strikes law. So their prison sentences eventually become quite similar to horrible crimes, like rape, murder, arson, even though it might be unfair for some. Right. So, what are the factors that judges consider when they are given discretion? So, if judges are treated as professional and they are allowed to have their honest evaluation, or they are able to call in professional psychologists or whatever, then these are the things that they would normally consider. They would consider the severity of that crime. So sometimes crimes are punished even worse when turns out that the person who committed this murder is like a true psychopath. Like they decided to boil their body or something, whatever, become a cannibal and so on. Then probably the judge would extend. The opposite also happens. Like turns out, this person was just a naive, immature person. Then they would consider that instead. We'll take a look at your criminal history, how you respond to possible rehabilitation, what is your economic background and your personal circumstances. I think the last two are the ones that allows judges to have some kind of range, like most often to be used as the source of uh, changing the range of their prison. Right. So if we were to acknowledge that the legislature is supposed to be independent of the judiciary, and the judiciary's job is just to read and interpret laws rather than write them, why do we still care about discretion? And why sometimes the legislature gives this power to judges? Probably because sometimes legislation are written in a vacuum. Sometimes legislation isn't sensitive to specific circumstances that has led people to do something. That's why there's a range to things instead, and judges have the ability to go up and down the range. So it's kind of unfair to have someone like probably, I don't know, 50 years ago writing all of this to determine you going to jail for how long. They cannot imagine your situation. They probably wrote it just because it's their job. They need to do that, whatever. But a judge, they could figure out the specific circumstances that led to somebody committing something. Let's say, for example, um, a person is involved in robbery because they are desperate. So maybe they're not supposed to go to jail for 5 to 8 years. Maybe a judge might decide 3 years, and you might get out in good behavior in 2 years, along those lines. Because um, turns out you're a good person. You're not evil, but you committed a crime. We want to discourage that. We still need to punish you, but we don't think it's fair for us to punish you for like 10 years. Someone who is unrepentant and so on. So the person writing those laws, they probably wouldn't put that range because they cannot imagine what is that person experiencing. It's so hard for them to imagine things 10, 15 years in the future. So it's only fair that sometimes judges are given that power as professionals. And sometimes there are people within the legislature who would like to combat certain prejudicial attitudes. So when they are writing like punishments for law and so on, you might have two people within the legislature arguing how long that law should be, etc. Or maybe it started off with mandatory minimums and then eventually changed into something else. It exists, and they confer it to judges because the other person writing the law might be quite prejudiced about some things. Maybe they want to punish when it comes to drugs because they have like a very racial bent to things instead. So that might be quite harmful when it comes to prosecuting someone. But why judges take into account personal circumstances? Um, the problem with um, a lot of punishments is that they don't actually solve the root cause a lot of things. So, for example, a person might end up in that environment I mentioned earlier, probably because of economic problems, alienation, or they have other behavioral problems. So, failing to address that is actually on the state. The state is supposed to provide opportunities for people so that they don't commit crimes. So, in order to acknowledge the failure of the state needs to figure out whether it's fair or not that people just automatically get punished. So this is where they just have to take into account, is it fair that this person is being punished because the state felt that? Maybe there is an economic area that is impoverished because that was the result of economic segregation in the past, or policies like redlining, and so on. And if you don't take that into account, then other factors don't become effective. So let's say, for example, if if the judge doesn't care about the lack of opportunities about a certain area, or we just need to overly punish this person, and this person will never be rehabilitated, and they will just ride those 10 years in jail because they think that the state has built them in the first place. So it's kind of hard to fix that mindset. So if you come to a middle ground and say that, yeah, we acknowledge that the state has failed, the state didn't do anything to fix your opportunities, that your situation, then they will realize, okay, at least someone there is looking out. Now I'll try my best to better myself. And I don't know, become a firefighter in prison and get out in 3 to 5 years because I become a good person at that. And then that eventually improves society rather than just punishing them. That's all. So when the state fails when it comes to economic hardship and they lose legitimacy for that, you need to cover up the legitimacy from a different angle. And then it normally comes from acknowledging all of these problems, and judges need to consider those personal circumstances.
Terrence, I can't hear you.
Again, right now.
It's very like faint. It's very light.
Right. Is it better?
Yeah, this is better.
All right, great. So when the state isn't able to fulfill all their duties in one angle, they have to cover up in a different angle. And this is where the state tries to course correct by giving judges the discretion and consider personal circumstances instead. Now, how then sentences can be shortened or lengthened? And this is where behavior comes in. So the efficacy of rehabilitation can be very dependent on individuals. Some people might be way more stubborn in comparison to others. Some might be, some might have the drive and incentive to become better people. They respond better. Or some people just find it hard to turn over a new leaf and build their character. It's not easy to sort of like break down the character and build it up again. So the state then acknowledges the good work that people put into their behavior and character. So this is where you have things like parole, where you're supposed to serve 5 years, but you can leave prison if you're a good person. You can visit your family, live with your family, but you probably have to report to your parole officer every few months. So you can live like a normal person out there, but you have to tell your supervising officer, or maybe you have to go to therapy along those lines. So that's parole, good behavior, but it's very dependent whoever that's evaluated. Or you might have house arrest, like you have electronic monitoring. So you have that ankle monitor and whatsoever. So they will install that at your house so that they know where you are. Because the first Ant-Man movie, he was in a house arrest, even though he was involved in a robbery. So I guess Ant-Man's character was perceived to be a quote unquote good person. So they said that, oh, you don't need to be in jail because you're a good person. We'll let you live with your kid, but you have to be in the house instead. Or they will allow you to serve in community service because you're a good person. They know that you won't hurt another person. Like if I were to send you to an old folks home, at least I know you won't shank that person or something. So yeah, you can work there instead, and you can commute your sentence instead. And then you have pardons, but pardons are very dependent on what that specific society thinks. I guess if that society suddenly realizes, wait, it's pretty messed up that we jail everyone who just wants to get high, so then they pardon them. And they're not evil people. Turns out, they just want to have fun in that case, but they get punished throughout the process. So yeah, so that's how prison sentences get shortened and lengthened. Right now, considering all of that, here are some of the motions that I think that you'll be able to debate with some of the arguments that I gave earlier. Uh, this house would give judges discretion on prison sentence according to economic background. This house believes that prominent figures should be punished with longer prison sentences. This house will not imprison non-violent offenders. Etc. This house executives' ability to run audits. This house believes that activists should advocate for prison abolishment as opposed to prison reform. This house would release prisoners based on their rehabilitation status rather than a set a predetermined length to their sentence. And lastly, this house would include the victim and or families of victims in consideration of prison length of sentencing and release. This house regrets Good Samaritan laws. This house would ban the use of faith-based rehabilitation in prisons. This house would allow individuals in prison to serve their sentences in the armed forces. All right, okay. So I guess to go back through the slides and fit the arguments here. So, all right, so that's it for this other session. All right.